Welcome back to 9M Discovery, everyone. As of 2023, the United States was the world's largest oil producer, pumping about 19.4 million barrels per day. By comparison, the next two producers, Saudi Arabia and Russia, each produced around 11 million barrels per day, less than two-thirds of U.S. output. Yet, here's the surprising part. Despite producing so much oil, the United States still imports large amounts of it, every day. The country brings in roughly 6 million barrels, second only to China, the world's biggest oil importer, at about 10 million barrels per day. The main suppliers to the U.S. include Canada, Mexico, Guyana, and Saudi Arabia, along with several other countries. At first glance, this seems contradictory. Why would a country that produces so much oil still need to import it? And why does the United States export oil to other nations while continuing to buy more from abroad? Is there a hidden reason behind this story? Let's find out together in today's video. In 2022, when gasoline prices in the United States surged, many people pointed to what seemed like a simple solution: use the country's vast domestic oil reserves. After all, the U.S. has more than 38 billion barrels of proven oil that remain untapped, along with millions of acres of land and offshore areas already approved for drilling but still unused. So, why not extract that oil to bring fuel prices down? If the U.S. could rely entirely on its own supply, wouldn't it reduce imports and help consumers? The reality, however, is far more complex. Experts say that even if all domestic oil were produced, fuel prices would not necessarily fall. While this may sound surprising, there is a clear explanation. Since 2018, the United States has repeatedly set oil production records. By 2020, daily output reached about 18.4 million barrels, while consumption was roughly 18.12 million barrels per day. In other words, the country was already capable of meeting its own demand with some oil left over. So, why doesn't the U.S. simply use all the oil it produces? The answer is straightforward. The country mainly produces light crude oil, while many refineries are designed to process heavy crude. Heavy crude contains more impurities and requires more complex and expensive refining, which is why it is generally cheaper. A few years ago, heavy crude averaged around $54 per barrel, compared to more than $70 per barrel for light crude. Yet, most U.S. refineries were built for heavy oil, reflecting decades of reliance on imports, especially from Mexico and Venezuela, regions with large reserves of heavy crude oil. Meanwhile, oil produced domestically in the United States is mostly light crude, creating a paradox. Even though the U.S. drills its own oil, it still has to import heavy crude to meet the needs of its refining system. To fully understand this issue, there is one key point to remember. Oil is one of the most important commodities in the world and is traded globally, yet it cannot be used directly. A barrel of crude oil fresh out of the ground is almost useless on its own. It must be refined before it can become fuel, industrial materials, or the everyday products people rely on. Its value depends not only on the oil itself, but also on many other factors: where it is extracted, where refineries are located, the available infrastructure, and where demand is highest. Not all crude oil is the same. Crude is classified into different types based on physical and chemical properties such as density, sulfur content, viscosity, and impurity levels. Each type is suited to a different refining process. Broadly speaking, crude oil falls into two main categories: light crude and heavy crude. Light crude is what most people are familiar with. It is thinner, less dense than water, and flows easily at normal temperatures. Heavy crude, by contrast, is thicker, more viscous, and far more difficult to process. These differences make oil refining complex, since there is no single method that works for every type of crude. Back in the United States, most oil extraction, refining, and fuel transportation infrastructure is concentrated in the central part of the country and along the Gulf Coast. This is why states such as Texas, Oklahoma, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Alabama often have some of the lowest fuel prices. They are home to the nation's largest refineries and most extensive distribution networks. America's oil pipeline system has existed for a very long time, dating back to the 1860s. In the early days, oil was transported mainly by horse-drawn wagons or boats, but these methods quickly became insufficient. In 1862, one of the first crude oil pipelines was built, an extremely simple gravity-fed structure made of wooden planks arranged in a V shape. Just a year later, in 1863, a more advanced iron pipeline was constructed in Pennsylvania, stretching about 2.5 miles and equipped with pumping stations. From that point on, the oil industry entered a new era as pipeline networks expanded and reshaped how energy was moved across the country. Even today, although the United States has nearly 160,000 miles of oil pipelines stretching across the country, there are still regions that are not connected to this network. California is a prime example. It is the most populous state in the U.S., with more people than the 21 least populated states combined, yet it is often described as an oil island. California has very few pipelines linking it to major oil-producing and refining regions elsewhere in the country. As a result, most of its fuel is transported by rail, trucks, or ships rather than through pipelines. This shows that from the moment oil is extracted to the point where it becomes the fuel people use every day, it goes through a long and complex journey shaped by countless factors. What may seem like a simple industry is actually a massive system that operates nonstop to support the modern world. The reality is that California imports about 70% of its crude oil from overseas, while relatively little comes from other U.S. states. So, why is that? The reasons are complex, but they can be summed up in two main factors: geography and state policy. California is largely disconnected from the main U.S. pipeline network, largely because building new pipelines would be extremely expensive, especially when oil may not even be essential in the long term. The state is steadily transitioning from gasoline-powered vehicles to electric vehicles, raising a simple question: why invest billions in oil infrastructure that may soon be less relevant? What about upgrading refineries instead? It sounds reasonable, but in practice, it's anything but simple. As of January 1st, 2024, the United States had 132 operating oil refineries. These facilities are critical to the economy, converting crude oil into gasoline, diesel, asphalt, and many other essential products. The biggest obstacle is cost. Partial upgrades, aimed at improving efficiency, cutting emissions, or meeting new environmental standards, can cost $50 to $100 million per refinery. A full-scale modernization, involving major technological overhauls to align with future energy trends, can cost several $billion per facility. Now consider the math. Upgrading all 132 refineries would require at least $130 to $200 billion, and that's likely a conservative estimate. Large industrial projects often exceed initial budgets due to rising material costs, rapid technological change, stricter regulations, and labor expenses. Many experts believe the true cost could be far higher than $200 billion. And that leads to the core problem. No one wants to make that investment. Not only is it enormously expensive, but U.S. government policy is increasingly focused on reducing oil production and consumption in favor of cleaner energy sources. As a result, oil companies are far less willing to pour money into long-term refinery upgrades, making such investments harder to justify in an industry facing gradual decline. Interestingly, instead of focusing solely on extracting and refining oil at home, the United States is actually making a great deal of money by doing something that sounds backwards: selling its own crude oil, then buying crude oil from other countries to refine. It may seem illogical at first, but in reality, it makes economic sense. In many countries, the cost of producing oil is far lower than in the U.S. Land leases, wages, taxes, and fees are cheaper. On top of that, the United States is constrained by the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, better known as the Jones Act, which requires goods transported between U.S. ports to be carried on ships that are U.S.-built, U.S.-owned, and crewed by American citizens. As a result, domestic oil transportation becomes extremely expensive. In many cases, it is cheaper to import oil from overseas than to move it within the country. In theory, transporting oil from Texas to the U.S. East Coast is possible. In practice, Texas oil is often exported to Asia, while the East Coast imports oil from across the Atlantic. This may sound strange, but transportation costs are the key reason. Under the Jones Act, moving oil from the Gulf Coast to the East Coast can cost up to 3 times more than importing the same amount of oil from foreign suppliers. Even though the U.S. has a highly developed port system, these legal and cost barriers remain significant. The law is the law. And that's why oil doesn't always flow in the direction that seems most logical. Now imagine this. What if the United States decided to rely only on its own oil? It sounds appealing, but the reality is more complicated. For decades, U.S. refineries have been optimized to process imported heavy crude oil. If they suddenly switched to domestic light crude, hundreds of billions of dollars invested in heavy oil processing equipment would become ineffective because existing systems wouldn't be compatible. A survey of energy experts shows that nearly 2/3 believe energy independence is not a realistic goal. Even if U.S. refineries could instantly adapt to domestic light crude, one major obstacle would remain transportation infrastructure. Many regions with large oil reserves lack adequate pipelines or port facilities to move oil where it is needed. Without efficient transport routes, having oil in the ground means very little. Moreover, the United States does possess heavy oil and oil sands, mainly in California, Alaska, and Utah. However, extracting and processing these resources is far more expensive than importing oil. The process consumes much more energy and water, yet supplies only about 10% of the nation's total oil demand, far too little to replace foreign imports. Building new drilling rigs and extraction facilities also cannot be done overnight. Even if construction began immediately, it would take at least 2 to 3 years to complete. After drilling, the oil still cannot be used right away. Another 6 to 8 months are needed before refining. Meanwhile, oil demand never stops, and any supply disruption could trigger fuel price spikes and serious economic consequences. So, what would happen if the United States truly stopped importing oil? Production would slow, prices would surge, and the economy would suffer heavy damage. Energy independence may sound appealing, but in reality it is not practical. Expanding extraction infrastructure would be extremely costly, especially as renewable energy continues to advance, making long-term oil investments increasingly risky. In short, although the U.S. holds vast oil reserves, relying entirely on domestic oil remains a complex challenge. That is why, whether it wants to or not, the United States will continue to depend on imported oil in the near future. All for the sake of the bears. At the northernmost edge of the world, amid the bone-chilling cold of the Arctic, lies a kingdom ruled by polar bears. But beneath its endless fields of ice are hidden treasures buried deep underground. Massive oil reserves formed over millions of years. For this reason, the region has long been a target in humanity's race for energy resources. Yet in April this year, the United States made a decision that drew global attention, banning oil drilling across nearly half of the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska. This vast area spans millions of acres and is home to countless rare wildlife species. Most notably, it serves as critical habitat for polar bears, caribou, and many migratory birds. The ban represents a bold move to protect the Arctic's fragile ecosystem, but it has also sparked intense debate. Supporters view it as a major step toward environmental protection and climate action. Critics, however, worry about losing a vital energy source, especially since Alaska has long been considered one of America's richest black gold regions. The transformation of the oil industry. Oil remains an essential part of the global economy. In 2023, the United States produced more oil than any country in history. By August 2024, production reached a record 13.4 million barrels per day, an unprecedented figure. Advances in extraction technology have driven this rapid growth, helping meet rising global energy demand. However, this expansion comes with serious environmental consequences. Vast drilling sites, tangled pipeline networks, and thousands of abandoned wells have created growing problems. In many areas, inactive wells continue to leak methane, a greenhouse gas far more potent than CO2. In the Gulf of Mexico alone, an estimated 14,000 abandoned wells remain inadequately sealed. If left unchecked, these wells could become environmental time bombs. Completely shutting them down, however, is no simple task. Sealing a single well can cost millions of dollars, and nationwide cleanup expenses could reach as high as $30 billion. As a result, many oil companies delay action, hoping for future drilling opportunities rather than absorbing the enormous cost. All for the sake of the bears. At the northernmost edge of the world, amid the bone-chilling cold of the Arctic, lies a kingdom ruled by polar bears. But beneath its endless fields of ice are hidden treasures buried deep underground. Massive oil reserves formed over millions of years. For this reason, the region has long been a target in humanity's race for energy resources. Yet in April this year, the United States made a decision that drew global attention, banning oil drilling across nearly half of the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska. This vast area spans millions of acres and is home to countless rare wildlife species. Most notably, it serves as critical habitat for polar bears, caribou, and many migratory birds. The ban represents a bold move to protect the Arctic's fragile ecosystem, but it has also sparked intense debate. Supporters view it as a major step toward environmental protection and climate action. Critics, however, worry about losing a vital energy source, especially since Alaska has long been considered one of America's richest black gold regions. The transformation of the oil industry. Oil remains an essential part of the global economy. In 2023, the United States produced more oil than any country in history. By August 2024, production reached a record 13.4 million barrels per day, an unprecedented figure. Advances in extraction technology have driven this rapid growth, helping meet rising global energy demand. However, this expansion comes with serious environmental consequences. Vast drilling sites, tangled pipeline networks, and thousands of abandoned wells have created growing problems. In many areas, inactive wells continue to leak methane, a greenhouse gas far more potent than CO2. In the Gulf of Mexico alone, an estimated 14,000 abandoned wells remain inadequately sealed. If left unchecked, these wells could become environmental time bombs. Completely shutting them down, however, is no simple task. Sealing a single well can cost millions of dollars, and nationwide cleanup expenses could reach as high as $30 billion. As a result, many oil companies delay action, hoping for future drilling opportunities rather than absorbing the enormous cost. Dear viewers, the story of America's oil industry is not just an economic or political puzzle. It reflects a deeper reality. Natural resources are rarely easy to exploit. They exist within a complex system where economic interests, government policy, and environmental concerns are tightly intertwined. Despite its vast oil resources, the United States still imports large amounts of foreign oil. This is not merely a matter of production volume, but also of oil type, refining technology, and transportation infrastructure. Together, these factors create a paradox that few truly understand. More importantly, this story offers a powerful lesson. Humanity cannot extract resources without limits. Long-term strategy, environmental protection, efficient energy use, and alternative solutions are just as crucial as extraction itself. If you found this video interesting and informative, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss future discoveries from 9M Discovery. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.